Good afternoon. Today is July 3rd, 2024. Today is going to be the first chapter of my biography. Nothing is to be copied without my permission. You can, and I encourage you to do so if you feel led to share the video with anyone you choose. Today is chapter 1, and I will be introducing you to my parents. My mother's name was Dorothy Virginia Holland. My father's name was David Wayne Magner. And they met, I believe, in Corona. And it was 1960, I believe, when they first met. My father, he was the youngest of the first 5 born children from my grandfather's only marriage and my grandmother's first marriage, because she left when my dad was only 3. My grandfather died when my father was only 10. So he was placed in a home with a family friend. They did not have, social workers or foster care basically at that time. So I can only assume it was originally an agreement between my grandfather and his friends. And so my uncles, James Magner, Donald Magner, and Gerald Magner, were older, and they went to a boys' home because they were too old for everybody to want to take them in. And then my aunt, Monabel Magner at the time, she went to live with a family by the last name of the Larsons. Monabel was able to stay in contact with the family, thankfully, and she, lived with this other family until she was of age. And my uncles, all of them, ended up going into the military, different branches. I believe Uncle Don was in the Navy, as was Uncle Gerald. Uncle Jim, I believe, went into the Army, and Army or Air Force. And so that was my dad, David Wayne Magner, and he was born from 2 healthy parents, but he came out with the osteogenesis imperfecta birth defect, which is also what I have. None of his other siblings have it. Neither of his parents had it. So the doctors just assumed it was a fluke. We're talking 1935 when he was born. So they didn't know really what medications you can or cannot take during pregnancy. And I was told later that she complained about headaches frequently while she was pregnant with him, and she was taking a lot of aspirin to get rid of the headaches. And so now, with, later technology and medical science and all that, they believe the aspirin very well could have been what caused the birth defect. So, after my grandfather died, when my dad was only 10, my dad also went to go live with the Larsons. And apparently they were not taking care of him. And his sister, I don't believe, was much older than him, maybe 3 or 4 years. And so she either wasn't able to, or, didn't feel it was her responsibility, but she was, in school herself. And so one day, there were, a group of teenagers going back and forth to school and whatnot, and they always would stop and talk to my dad and, see how he was doing, because he would always be in the front yard, usually in a high chair or like a stroller type thing, because they either didn't have wheelchairs back then or they weren't really ready available. So this one particular time, uh, these two twin girls that were in high school, my dad was only about 10, they went to school 3 days in a row, and they kept noticing my dad was sitting exactly in the same spot. He was wearing the same clothes, and he was crying. He was upset. And so they just took him home. And they knew something was not right, because 3 days later he shouldn't be in exactly the same spot and the same clothes and whatever. And he did say that he was hungry, and I don't know what time of year it was, but probably it wasn't summertime, because otherwise I'm surprised he didn't dehydrate, and become really ill or even die. But so they took him home, and apparently it was only 2 days later when the family that was supposed to be taking care of him even noticed he was gone and called the authorities. And so I don't know if the police probably already knew where to possibly look for him, because the teenagers that took my dad home with them, he was actually a pastor, Pastor Cornell. I call him Grandpa Cornell. So he and his wife also had, I believe, 7 of their own children, and they were also running an orphanage from children who survived from war. I think it was World War II, but I'm not 100% sure. I know quite a few of them were Asian children, because my dad told me, and they had a ranch. It was Cornell Ranch out there. I believe again it was in Corona, and so he stayed there until he was 21 years old. Back then, it was the law that physically or mentally disabled children had to stay home until they were 21, and even after 21, they had to be at least mentally stable to take care of themselves and things like that. And so he lived there until he was 21. He was very active in the church. He played electric keyboard. He played steel guitar. He played harmonica. He played ukulele. I feel like I'm leaving some other instruments out, but he was very musical. And I love music. I tried to, learn the trumpet at one time. I tried to learn guitar at one time. I was better at the guitar than I was trumpet, but and I liked it more. But anyway, so he was very active, and I know he had told me that he had met Billy Graham with Grandpa Cornell a few times. I don't know if it was Grandpa Cornell went on an evangelical trip with them, or if Billy Graham came to Grandpa Cornell's church. I don't know. But so, and that's another story. Grandpa Cornell, he at one time was had become disabled as a teenager. He was swinging on a, back in the day they swung on tires, and they would say Geronimo, and they would go off and drop down in the little lakes or rivers or whatever. And, back before electronics were ever around, and kids knew how to entertain themselves. And anyway, so apparently this one time he ended up swallowing some water, or it went up his nose, and there was something in the water that made him very ill, and he became crippled. And so they actually had to carry him to the house, And he was like that for, I believe, 2 years. And, I'm assuming Grandpa Cornell's parents were very Christian as well. I don't think I ever met them. Maybe they were already gone by the time I came about. But um, all I remember is my dad telling me the story that Grandpa Cornell told him. And it was that he was home with his parents, Grandpa Cornell was. He was home with his parents and, laying there in bed, and he couldn't walk. He couldn't speak very well. He had lost a tremendous amount of weight. He was not growing at a normal rate of height, even for his age. And his parents, of course, were concerned he was going to die. And nobody knew who this man was, but they remember a black man with a very white beard, wearing a white sheet or robe or something like that, came knocking on the door. He said, "I'm here to pray for the crippled man." And nobody knew who he was, but they let him in. They're like, "Well, everybody else has been praying for him. Prayer, you never reject prayer. So they let him come in, and they all laid hands on him. They anointed him with oil with this black man, whoever he was. And a few days, he was able to somewhat sit up that day, and he was able to start, slowly getting up over the next few days. It wasn't quite the miraculous healing like you have seen or heard about in the Bible, but it was nonetheless a healing. So, my dad told me, later his parents went back to their church and said, "Does anybody know who this man was?" Nobody knew who that man was, and nobody had seen him ever again. So, for all we know, it could have been an angel that came and prayed for my Grandpa Cornell. And so eventually, within a few weeks, he was up and walking. He did have to walk with a cane. He wore braces, I believe, on his legs for a little while. At first, they tried to say it was polio. Back in those times, maybe it was. But whatever it was, he got it from that stagnant water. And he nor any of the other kids in the area were allowed to go back to that water. And so, but as he grew up, he was, very thankful for what that black man did. Whether he was a black man, a black angel, he's the one that God sent to my Grandpa Cornell and healed him. And later, my Grandpa Cornell became a preacher of pretty much a mostly all black church, and Grandpa Cornell was a white man. And anyway, so then my dad moved out when he was 21, and he somewhat moved out on his own. The twins that took him home were older than him. So Leota Hale Cornell at the time, Leota Cornell had already moved out, and she had gotten married, and by that time she was Leota Miller. So anyway, she moved out, she got married, she had 2 children, and when my dad, it was time for him to move out, he moved in with her, but they converted the garage into an apartment for him because my dad was a little smaller than I am, and back in those times, they did not have power wheelchairs at all. And so they had to lower, he never really cooked for himself other than simple things after he moved out, like eggs and, grilled cheese, real simple things, because of his reach. And so they actually cut the legs off the stove so that it would be lower so that he could reach it. Technology today has made my life a whole lot easier. And I, again, am very thankful. So I'm assuming he lived with Mama Leota and her first husband up until he married my mother. My mother's name was Dorothy Virginia Holland, and from what I understand, her father was not active. Her parents divorced when she was around 8 or 9 years old, and her mother was a hardworking woman, but she was also at least verbally abusive. I don't know about the physical part. Um, so, but her mother worked at a coffee shop nearby, and my dad would frequently go to that coffee shop, and he would have, usually, one meal a day, and then he would eat one meal at home with Mama Leota. And so that's how he met my mother. And they were friends for a while, and my mother had moved out of her mother's home, and she was financially struggling, and I don't know if she worked or I'm assuming she did, but she was always running short on her bills, and she would go to my dad. And it's funny because back in those times, there was no American Disability Act, and because we're talking around 1960, right? American Disability Act did not come into play until 1978, and so, um, but my dad was not a lazy man, and he actually told me that a lot of employers were more willing to hire disabled people back in those times before the ADA law came about, So he was a dispatcher for a taxi cab at one time, and he was a dispatcher for a trucking company at one time. He was a hotel manager at one time. He's done a lot of various jobs. Well, one thing that helped him was he did not develop the hearing problem. Part of the birth defect, usually you either end up with hearing impairment or visual impairment. And usually you don't get both. Dad, toward the end, his vision was pretty bad, and my up close vision is not great. Distance, I can see still pretty well. Um, I just got new hearing aids, and people find it hard to believe when I tell them without my hearing aids, I am 97% deaf. And they're like, but you speak so well. I didn't start losing my hearing until I was about 14. And so by then, I already knew how to speak and form my words. And still, even now, when I get tired, I even notice I have to concentrate more on my speech to make sure it's clear. And I know there's been times that I've been on the phone with family, and like mostly my niece, who is a nurse now, she'll ask me if I'm okay because sometimes I sound funny to her. And usually that's when I get to talking too fast and don't really think about my speech. So, but anyway, that's kind of jumping. But so anyway, so my dad and my mother became friends, and my dad jokingly was told my mother, well, if I'm going to keep paying your bills, you may as well marry me. It'll save me a lot of money. And so I don't know if she thought he was serious, or she thought, well, I'm going to say yes and see what his reaction is. He'll, get chicken and run the other way. I don't know what she was thinking, or what either of them were thinking, because, in my opinion, they were not a good match. But, so she said yes, and shortly thereafter, they got married. And so I was told that before they started having children, that they went to the doctor to see if the birth defect was indeed hereditary, and they were told it was not. Well, this is only like 1961, so medical science probably really didn't know a whole lot of what even he had. Even today, I usually have to tell doctors what I have. I feel very blessed if I find a doctor that walks into the examining room and can tell me what I have and what it is, and he knows how to treat it. It's really sad that in 2024 there are still a lot of doctors that don't know what it is. Nurses either. So, but so they decided to have children, and so in 1963, my sister Rosalind May Magner was born, and she was born physically normal. Later in life, she did have, I'm talking around 7 or 8 years old. She did have problems with her hips where they would sometimes dislocate and they didn't know why. And I remember when she had to walk with crutches for a long time. They said, well, if she walks with crutches for about 6 months, the hips should go back together and back into place. They'll grow in on their own or whatever. And so I remember for the longest time she would walk on crutches, and eventually she did, got to where she didn't need them anymore. Which later she told me that was part of the reason why she decided to have children fairly early. I don't really think it was planned, but that's the story she gave me and stuck to it. But they told her they didn't think she would be able to have children because her hips wouldn't let her carry them. So I wondered if she had like what they call a takeoff. But then, back in those times, we were only told there was five, uh, 5 different types of the osteogenesis imperfecta, OI for short. If you want more information, go to oif.org, and there's a whole foundation on my birth defect. But I believe they have discovered that there are 8 types of my birth defect. And so it is getting to be more commonly known, I guess, but when they decided, my sister was okay, not quite a year later, I was born, and obviously I got the same birth defect as my father did, and I was told that while my mother was pregnant, I had broken roughly 50 bones, and they healed before I was born, and then as I was born breech, and so my hips once again broke and they were dislocated, and I had a lot of ailments when I was born. Even though my mother says I was overdue, I still barely only weighed 5 pounds. I was 14 inches long, and so I had a lot of health problems. And when I was a real young child, my bones broke easily. By the time I was born, though, my dad had outgrown the part where he broke as easily. He still broke easier, even me as an adult, than, he broke easier than I did. So it's just kind of interesting. We have the same birth defect, but affected us in different ways to certain degrees. So I'm going to end this chapter. That's a little bit about my parents. And then I guess I will go on to more about me and my parents in the next chapter. God bless you. Thank you for listening. And I hope you have a happy and safe 4th of July. Take care.